This show and everything else on Complex Action is made possible by the generous support of our patrons on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/complexaction to learn more. So I have a fun question for you. Every edition introduces these new meta plots to Shadowrun. What's your favorite Shadowrun meta plot?
I like the Azatlan / horrors meta plot for whatever reason.
Oh, yeah.
It kind of peaked in second edition. Might have been early third. I think it was second though. The idea that the tie-ins to Earth Dawn as well. Although I wasn't into Earth Dawn as much. But I just love the idea that the horrors were these kind of nameless, faceless, chthonic things that were, coming across, and it tied in with the lore of the Great Ghost Dance and Azatlan and their blood magic, and the creep factor there was just incredibly huge, and it felt so not cyberpunk.
Right. Okay, yeah.
So to have cyberpunk clashing with that kind of old world energy really created something that was kind of special. And so along with that, all the immortal elves and the and the Harlequin storyline, I don't know, it's cliche, and I know a lot of people hate Harlequin. I know Opti in character absolutely loathes Harlequin, but I actually really like Harlequin and all that kind of grandiose, epic storytelling stuff. I have my characters interact with those guys on a regular basis because I love that stuff. I love the epicness, the Lord of the Rings.
No kidding. I think, and this is one of the great things about Shadowrun, how it mixes all of these genres and worlds together. But yeah. I mean, speaking of that, one of my favorite things that I know almost nothing about, because again, I'm just now trying to penetrate the lore, but is all the lore about the dragons and their like the dragon war that just happened recently, the Civil War, and everything that led up to that, with Dunkelzahn's death and all that kind of stuff. I think that's so amazing because I like this. I think what appeals to me so much about that is there's this godlike, it's almost like Greek mythology, where you've got this pantheon of gods that have their own drama and conflicts, and you've got the mortals on the ground who are just like peons and nothings to them, who are just like pawns to play in this. They don't care anything about them, and that's like what I think about when I think of the dragons, and they have their own agendas and conflicts and dramas that they're dealing with, and we're just people in the way or tools at their disposal. And then you always have the one or two like Dunkelzahn who are so sympathetic to the struggles of those tiny people.
No, I think that's an apt metaphor. And in the Greek mythology, you always have the one or two mortals who somehow kind of brush up against the gods and get involved in their business and do great things in spite of themselves. And I think Shadowrun lends itself really well to that as well. Somehow you have these runners get involved with deals with dragons and put themselves on the map, and it's got an epic feel to it. As opposed to like Dungeons and Dragons, where dragons are kind of blasé and
right.
I killed a dragon today, no big deal.
Right. I played Shadowrun for a long time before I ever played Dungeons and Dragons, and I remember playing with this DM, and we encountered a dragon in the game, and I thought it was a huge deal. I was like, oh my god, it's a dragon, and everybody like kind of looked at me like, hey, we're just gonna kill this thing and move on, like.
That's one of the things I love about Shadowrun, as opposed to the other high fantasy stuff, is dragons are just a big deal. I had to explain to my characters, because they had never played Shadowrun or anything else. I said, look, this is not like an MMO. This is not like you're gonna eventually get to the point where you're gonna kill a dragon and you're gonna be the hero. You are not the hero, and if you see a dragon, you need to run. Right. You're just never ever going to get to the point where you're fighting dragons and winning. That's just not going to be a thing. So,
yeah, exactly.
And I think that instilled a healthy fear in them, to the point where they the other day my runners just looked up in the sky and saw a dragon flying overhead, and that has paranoid them for like 3 or 4 weeks in a row. They keep referencing, is that dragon going to come back? Are we messing with the dragon, right? And it just creates this paranoia for a group that, again, it's hard. It's easy to do in Shadowrun, to create a paranoia, to create a sense of emotion. And in Dungeons and Dragons, it's a little bit harder to do that. Dungeons and Dragons as a game does something different than Shadowrun does, and I like them both, but ultimately Shadowrun is where I hang my hat.
So, being someone who loves the story of Shadowrun, and speaking of how it's different than other games, how do you feel about, or how do you deal with the fact that one of the things that makes Shadowrun unique is that it's this living, breathing world from edition to edition, you know, and it's a lot different than a lot of, you know, typical popular RPGs in that way.
Yeah.
And what do you think about that? Like, do you feel like how do you deal with the fact that your players may or may not be able to affect, or maybe they can, and I'm just rambling here, but how do you deal with the fact that you are players who are people who are just in this world that is happening around them?
I'm of two minds about that. Firstly, because when I grew up playing video games and playing other games in the 80s and 90s, we were all told that we were the hero of our own story, Absolutely. That we were very special, that we are amazing, that we can do anything we set our minds to. The Care Bears told us over and over again that just, you know, we give enough oomph to something and we'll make it happen, and we're awesome and we have a destiny. And then you become adults and you realize it's like really, really, really not true in any way, shape, or form. Like, we're just like everybody else.
Right.
And so I find myself, when MMOs first came out in the late 90s, when that started becoming a thing, I found myself playing those games and thinking, like, this is amazing, until I got to the higher levels and I realized, like, all I'm doing is just running around with a bunch of people just like me.
Yeah.
And, like, I didn't feel epic at all. I felt like I was chasing just the next greatest thing to keep up with the people who already have it. And I'm like, who am I? Like, you know, who is my guy? Like, oh, it's Opti the Barbarian. And I'm like, you know, I don't feel special. So I think over time, the next 5 years, I went back to playing just a single player games, because at the end of the day, I want to feel like the hero. I want to feel like the guy that, you know, my authority figures in the 80s and 90s told us we were going to be, which is not true. So two minds. I still like to feel like the hero, but I'm also realizing that view of myself is very problematic, and I'm not sure that I want to propagate it. The generation after me, who grew up with MMOs, don't have that. They don't have I'm the hero of my own story. They play MMOs and they play, you know, interactive games because they're social with it. Sure, it's just a way of being social and a way of hanging out, which is not how I interact with games and media very much at all. So I'm realizing that their way is probably a lot healthier. They probably have a better understanding of themselves and relationship to the world. So having said that, Dungeons and Dragons always lets you be the hero. The progression, the level progression, you hit level 30 and you are God. You know, like, literally your paths end up with you killing gods, being a god, taking over God, becoming a force of nature. Like, that is just the trajectory for a Dungeons and Dragons game.
Yeah, I mean, it's practically written into the mechanics of the game.
Right. So, you know, eventually you get to the point where you're just you one shot whatever entity you want, and that's just how it happens.
Right.
Shadowrun will never be like that. Shadowrun, because of what it is, you will never be the ultimate hero. Or if you do, somehow, it's usually because you died doing something really epic, and we'll memorialize you when we have our next, you know, drink of synthahol. And I there's something about that reminds us a little bit more of real life. So Shadowrun, to me, and this will get in maybe to another topic that we might or might not want to get into.
Yeah.
But as Cyberpunk, it does not lend itself to heroism and to a lot of grandiose self backpatting stuff. Cyberpunk is a critique of the world as it is, and yes, there's a lot of lore, but even if you take the lore out of it and just play the game kind of with what you're presented in the introduction in the rule book, it's still it's still this idea that you get to play in this thing and you're not the hero. You get to experience this world as it is created. How do I say it? It's fantasy, not as escapism, but it's fantasy as you getting to try out new experiences. Right. Does that make sense?
Yes, absolutely.
I think there's a difference. Like when you dream at night. Oh God, I'm getting really philosophical here. When you dream at night, like one of the things your brain is doing is it is allowing you to try out new experiences and giving you situations and allowing you to react and to have those experiences without actually having to go through them in real life.
Right. You're experimenting with this, putting on this different, facade and saying, okay, what if I interact with the world with this approach versus this approach? And so not so much escapism like you're saying, but like, let's try it differently.
Right. Like thought exercises.
Yeah,
you know
exactly.
what I mean? Like, hey, what if the world was like this? How do you interact with it? Having said that, like with Opti being a neo-anarchist, I had to research a lot of neo-anarchism and what that means, and I find myself kind of going, "Oh, I actually agree with a lot of this." It actually makes a lot more sense. It makes a ton more sense in the Shadowrun setting, but even today, I find myself thinking like, "Wow, a lot of this is actually fairly legitimate," in its own context. So, the thought exercises that Cyberpunk, in general terms, that in Shadowrun in particular allow you to have, is just a different thing than this kind of wish fulfillment of D&D. And so I like it for that, and I'm willing to kind of say without the ongoing storyline and the consequences to runners making actions and those actions persisting, I don't know that you would actually be able to have those extended thought experiments.